Well, good morning and welcome to another episode of Unpublic with Citizen Stewart. Today's a great day. It's not often that you get to interview one of your sheroes from long back. So today is that day for me. Like I have a long list of guests that over like 2 to 3 years that I have not gotten to everybody that I think was played a real role in how I developed the way that I see the world when it comes to education. As a person who was a layperson and a parent and just a pissed off parent with a problem who eventually became an activist, at some point I needed information to go beyond being an activist, but to also become an informed activist, an activist who was curious, intellectually curious about the problems that we were trying to solve. Years ago, when I was on a board, I used to get on every email list that I could possibly get on. And my email, this is back to when email wasn't the primary way you got information, but my box would fill up with reports and graphs and books from people. And some of them were more important than others, but none were more important than the education trust information. When I finally happened upon the education trust information, it was really important to me because it was doing something that none of the other information was doing. It was using data and statistics and information to prove the point that kids can learn at high levels. We used to say it all the time in my life and on the school board. All kids can learn at a high level, but we never really had an example to point anywhere. We could never, in our district, we really didn't have any schools where we could say, see. We had a few charter schools here and there that maybe were breaking ground. But when I got hold of the dispelling the myth information, Ed Trust used to put out these really long PowerPoints, and they used to make them city or state specific. So I would go reading other people's mail. I'd read the Florida one, and I'd read the one on another state and bring it back to Minnesota and say, listen, we have to stop living in a silo. Look at this PowerPoint from Florida, for instance, with just the most kind of inarguable finite information in one PowerPoint. You would be able to tell people this is possible. This is what the world could look like. I remember, and this is the last part of the introduction of my shiro, I'll say, is I remember a friend locally telling me, Chris, the environmental movement has messed up by doing the we're all going to die scenario with climate change. And she said, what you need to do is tell people this is what a tomato is supposed to taste like. And I never really got it in the beginning when she would say that, because I thought she was saying we should just sugarcoat stuff. And she was saying, no, you need to show people what's possible. So my guest, Kati Haycock, is the founder of the Education Trust, and for years was the golden warrior of the Education Trust, the warrior of what I call achievement gospels, in that it's being done, it can be done. Let's dispel the myth. Let's get under the hood. Let's look at what successful educators are doing when they successfully educate kids, and also let's do it with receipts. Let me tell you an exact school. This is how I found George Hall Elementary School in Alabama. It's through the work of people like Kati and Kati's team. And, later I was introduced to other people from the team or who were associated with Education Trust, who just kind of made it simple and plain. Our kids can learn. And we'll tell you how. Kati, good morning. Thank you so much for that.
Chris.
Here's that long run up to you, to you coming on.
I think I can just, I can quit now. So thank you.
No, I really appreciate the work that you did over a long period of time, because it was so straightforward. It wasn't a bunch of smoke and mirrors, but it really was hopeful. It was like, we can do better. And one of the biggest problems that I have right now is that I really feel like we've fallen into an essentialist belief that if a kid doesn't have two white college educated parents, they're just doomed. Yeah. And we talk that way in education, not we, I should say, but many from the establishment do. Yep. Can we go back in the years when you were starting, you had the idea to form an organization, to build an organization around the idea that it can be done, that kids can learn. What was your driving factor? What information did you have, and why was it the right time for you to do it then, to build your organization?
Sure. I came to Washington in 1989 as the executive vice president of the Children's Defense Fund. And one of the sort of driving questions during my time there was, could CDF sort of launch itself into what we thought was a kind of second era of advocacy? That is, you've got access to, in this case, education, or in other cases, healthcare and so on. But now the issue is quality. And the answer to that question for CDF turned out to be no. But when you sit in Washington, and this was true when I was in California before that, looking at Sacramento, and you look at what are the forces that drive education policy at the state and federal level, what you saw is all of the forces were essentially those of the status quo. Teachers unions, administrator associations, school board associations, essentially those who either worked in or in some ways benefited from the current system as it was. There was no voice for kids, especially poor kids and kids of color. And the need for that, as you sort of watched all this money being allocated, but with no reform edge on it, and no drive for better outcomes for the kids who needed that attention, the need was obvious. And so we set about sort of building a new organization that would make that case. But the sort of important part of that decision was sort of the question is, what's your main tool here? And it seemed clear to us at that point that without data, you're just kind of another guy with an opinion, right? Mm-hmm. And so what we set out to do was to cull through these huge amounts of data that schools and districts and states produce on education that but mostly sits unanalyzed, and try to tell both the story of need, and that really means being really super honest about the problems, but also provide enough hope and enough direction by identifying exceptions to those patterns that would actually energize people and focus them on more effective strategies. So that's the ambition.
Did you have some examples in mind? Were you doing, school visits, or did you have some information that made you think we need to dig deeper into this?
It is always true that when you look underneath averages, there are exceptions. And that is true in a classroom, that is true in a school, that is definitely true in a school district and in a state. So yes, you see these patterns where poor kids in particular are lagging behind other kids, or African Americans behind white kids. Mm-hmm. Yes, that is true when you look at averages, but underneath that, there are always schools that are doing way better than others, that are either improving faster or just knocking it out of the park. We were talking about mm-hmm. George Hall. George Hall in its day was one of the top performing schools in the entire state of Alabama, mm-hmm. despite mm-hmm. having started as one of the lowest performing schools. And, the school board there had, pretty much thought, well, what do you expect, right? The neighborhood right. around it was mostly poor, mostly African-American, lots of single parent families, and sort of all the excuses. But when they sent in a new leader who restaffed the school and started in a new direction, what you saw is those kids who nobody thought could learn were actually hitting it out of the park, and not mm-hmm. just at the proficient level, actually in the case of that school, at the advanced level on the state assessment. So again, when you begin peeling the data back, there are always exceptions, even at the state level. There are states that are improving much faster than others. There are districts where the performance of African-American fourth graders, for example, even low-income African-American fourth graders, is 2 or 3 grade levels above the same kids in another school district. So, mm-hmm. You don't have to spend much time with the data to see that there are examples that we can learn from. And, the private sector does this too, right? They're mm-hmm. identifying mm-hmm. companies that are earning more, improving faster, and so on. There's resistance there too, I am told, to learning from the leaders. It's usually the kind of middle performers that are aiming at the top, as opposed to the low performers that learn from those. But we basically decided to use the data both to create outrage at the problems, but also to create energy and hope around the solutions.
You just used the word resistance. And if you had to ask me about today, I could tell you very clearly who the resistance is and why it is. But I can't tell you that about, earlier times in these type of efforts. What would have been the resistance back then to saying, hey, guys, let's look at great schools. Let's just look at great schools that are doing a great job.
The resistance mostly comes from those who work in the system, who don't, education often feels to me like, crabs in boiling water, like one starts crawling up and the other one's pulling back down, right? So instead of saying, hey, that guy got out of the boiling water by using a particular strategy, we want to pull him back in. When there are schools that are unusually high performers, their principals are accused of, they're cheating, going on. We have all kinds of reasons for dismissing them because they make us feel like, oh, maybe the problem is us, when it's way more comfortable to believe the problem is the kids.
So even then, you would have said back then, there was the blame the kids syndrome even back then.
Oh my God, yes. No, we have always blamed kids and families, and frankly, the research establishment with their regression lines have contributed to that. Like, the few pieces of data that you see in ed school, all are about the regression line. Nobody ever says, let's look underneath the data here and say, whoa, yes, in fact, as the poorer a school is, on average, the lower its performance is. But is that true of all high poverty schools? Answer, absolutely not. But that's not what they teach you in grad school.
Well, here's how, how much of a layperson, outside activist I was on the board. I can remember the first time seeing a scatter plot. Because, the most damning thing in statistics is to say, well, the correlation between poverty, race, and low achievement. And I always used to say, well, you can't argue with correlations. Like correlation. Wow, that sounds like a big word. Wow, yeah, that's true, man. God, yeah. What's also correlated with high achievement? White skin. So maybe we should just outlaw blackness, right? Like, if we just get rid of blackness, everybody will be,
For sure.
But the moment that I saw a scatter plot, and I had to ask a question and say, well, wait a second now, all these schools are poor.
Right.
And all of them have mostly Black students. But for some reason, these few are up here and these other ones are all crowded down here. So now tell me more about those other schools. Tell me about. And I remember someone on staff like thinking, aha, the light just went on in him. He got it. That's what they meant to say. They meant to say, if you take all let's take all rich schools, all mostly white schools out of the data set and just have schools that have high poverty, high concentrations of kids of color. And you look at a scatter plot, some are clearly going to be doing better than the others. So why not study that? That doesn't make any sense. What were the?
We don't do that.
Yeah.
We just don't. I gave a presentation, a couple of years ago to students at Teachers College in Columbia who were at the last semester of their grad school experience there. And as I was talking, I was seeing just anger. And I kept thinking, I was feeling like it was targeted at me. And I was trying to figure out what the hell's going on here. And finally, one of them just exploded and said, why haven't we been taught this stuff in grad school? Why do we have to come down here to Washington and talk to you? And two African-American students described their experience of having actually taken in some data from underneath the scatter plot to a class and said to the professor, why don't we talk exactly the question you asked? Why don't we talk about these schools? And he just shut them down and said, we're not here to talk about the exceptions. We're here to talk about the rule. Just kind of going, oh my Lord.
I've heard you mention that before, though, that I don't remember how you said it, but that like, let's focus on failure thing, like the rule is a backwards way of looking at the world.
Totally.
If you want more failure, you would study failure. That's right.
We seem to be pretty good at doing that without studying it.
You know what I think is really interesting about those students that you mentioned in the class who were really upset about it? I felt the
Mhm.
exact same way at some point.
Mhm.
When I started discovering that we've known all along that we have some great schools
Yeah.
that are really doing a good job, it started making me really angry about the drumbeat of, hey, if kids are poor, you've got to lower
They
your
just can't.
expectations.
Right.
Yeah, they can't learn.
Right.
When you started doing this work and you were building out in the beginning, what were the policy enablers that you learned were going to be important if you really wanted to have the world that you wanted?
I mean, I think in the end, our conclusion is that it's a combination of resources and accountability. That unless schools are accountable for improving the outcomes for all kids, and in particular for the groups of kids that have been underserved, that no matter how much you give them in way of extra resources, things are not going to get better. And some people say, well, that's all about sticks. And all I can say is, when you look at the data, sticks work. It's a horrible thing to say, and I wish it were not true. But we make more progress in education when not making progress has consequences for those who work in schools.
Um, so when you say sticks, what would be a stick? What would be like one that you think actually is effective and drives achievement?
Well, certainly labeling has been important.
Yeah.
States that have had more honest and simpler to understand, especially for parents, school rating systems. States that make it matter to your rating, not how just the averages look, but how all groups of kids are doing. Those kinds of ratings, again, not these complex algorithms that nobody can make sense of, but something that's really honest, really drives action. And certainly, I mean, Florida is a very good example of how much sort of parent action was driven by a simple school rating system that had consequences.
So when you rate the schools, I imagine that you're fine with assessments.
Absolutely.
Yeah, annual assessments, student assessments. Where do you come down on things like state standards?
I mean, state standards are essential to the development of assessments that actually measure something that's important. So I am definitely a believer that having clear standards and then having assessments that measure whether kids are meeting those or not are essential. It's not the only measure I want to look at when I'm looking at how a school is doing, but it's a really important measure.
And it feels like over time we've really we've allowed people to attack the instruments rather than the outcomes.
And that's happening, unfortunately, on both sides of the political equation, which is a problem. But frankly, even if you're skeptical about tests, pretty much every measure that you look at is going to show you very much the same pattern. So people say, well, why don't we use grades instead? Well, there are challenges with using grades because you make something that subjective a part of your accountability system. There's going to be temptation to screw with it. Yeah. That said, if you look at data by race for a school district, for example, you will see very much the same patterns with grade point average that you do with tests. And that's true when you look at advanced course enrollments, advanced course completion, high school graduation, college entry, college success. So even non-test-based measures are still showing us we have a problem, but those same measures are also showing us that some folks are solving those problems better than others. And it's true at the college level as well. We can take a set of colleges that have essentially the same student populations in terms of poverty, race, whatever you want to measure, and then look at their 4, 5, or 6 year graduation rates, whopping differences, depending on what they do, not the complexion of the kids. And it's that message, and having multiple measures that show you the problem is useful, because it means that if you just have a test-based conversation, there are a set of people who just check out.
Mm.
So we've learned over time you need to broaden those measures, even though tests are fundamentally important to know about the actual learning that goes on.
It's funny, you go to the doctor, they, I don't know about yours, but mine, it's just like routine. You take the blood pressure test before I do anything else. And it's kind of like, I never yell at them, I'm more than my blood pressure. You know, I'm so much more than my blood pressure. You know, they're like, yeah, that's cute, Chris. But, you know, or you go get a home loan. I'm more than my credit score. Yeah. Okay, Chris, that sounds great. Who were the champions in the time that you were your work was new and you were really getting into it? Who were the policy champions? Who were the political leaders that you think actually were the example of what we need more of now?
Yeah, I mean, we had the advantage of working at a time when bipartisanship was still possible, and one of the things that meant is that we needed both Democrats and Republicans who sort of got it, who understood the urgency of change, but who were also willing to work together across partisan lines to get that done. So when I think about the energy that created No Child, I mean, that was literally Ted Kennedy, George Miller on the left, George Bush and John Boehner on the right. And there in the end was literally no space between them. There was in the beginning, but not in the end. And it's just kind of a reminder that that kind of, you need people who are courageous enough to push their own party, but also willing to work across the aisle. And it's what I worry about right now. That's very hard to find that.
It doesn't feel like that is going to be happening again for a while.
Not in the short term, I don't think. I think we got a lot of work to do to rebuild some bridges there, but that's a tough one. And we held on to it longer in education than anything else. But we didn't hold on to it forever.
So you focus so long on outcomes, student outcomes, school outcomes, but did you ever fall in love with any particular way of getting to those outcomes? Like, did you develop a secret passion that you never told anybody about for like Montessori or, like no excuses charters, or was there one way, but you never really said that you preferred one way or another?
No, I mean, high quality instruction is always going to be the key to anything we do, right? It's teachers who both believe that kids can achieve and who are willing to respect them in the way that kids respond to. And respect really means challenge. High challenge, but high support. So, I mean, somewhere in that nexus is the key to most of the work that we've looked at. And now at the college level, things are a little different. It's really about intentionality. It's about using data constantly. It's about really aggressive systems of acting on those data to make sure students stay on track. But certainly at the K-12 level, it's largely about instruction.
It really feels like education has won the war against data. Like I've argued that, like, we've got kind of like a QAnon type of ed movement that is like anti-data, like, our instruction should not be data driven. That takes all the joy out of education. And as a person working on the outside, I'm kind of always like, really? Is that? Yeah. It's kind of like accountants going like, I hate numbers. It doesn't make any sense to me. Is that like, do you think that that's just like a long, cynical movement to resist accountability? Or do you really believe some educationists believe that you're trying to ruin their system by making it all about numbers and less about kids?
No, I mean, there are certainly some who believe that. And, it's just like those who continue to believe that teachers should make up every lesson from scratch. I mean, you talk to most teachers and they say, please don't make me do that.
No, yes.
But there are those who still argue that giving teachers scripted lessons or even fulsome lessons and asking them to actually teach them is a horrible thing to do. So yes, there are always people like that. But I think in general, the war that's been temporarily won is a war that basically people are not thinking and talking about outcomes a lot now. Even, I mean, you focused a lot of attention, Chris, recently on early reading. And I know Kate Walsh has been doing great work on that at NCTM. The learning disability community is spending a lot of energy on that as well. But we're still not making the progress we could make if teachers got the training and support and materials they needed. And it's that our unwillingness to take that on is the foundation of so much later failure, right? It's just too easy. It's too easy to blame it on the kids after fourth grade if they can't read.
Yeah, if they can, and their parents in their home, and
yeah. And that's just it's just it's a problem, and we got to figure out how to regenerate concern about that. I mean, even like, it used to be when the international exam results came in, people here would get a little anxious, like, whoa, look at us. We're 27th in the developed world in mathematics. That's a problem. But now it's kind of, oh, well, whatever. So look, we're thriving economically no matter what. So how to rebuild sort of righteous concern about what our young people are prepared to do. I mean, you think a little bit about what's happened with the pandemic economy, very much what happened in 2008. The jobs that disappeared and are not reappearing are the ones that are held largely by students young people who completed high school or less. Right. The ones that disappeared and don't reappear. So that happened in 2008. 2/3 of the recovery went to college educated workers, and that's going to happen again. So we've got to get some energy behind way more energy behind to and through college. Right. This is not about to and through high school. It's about to and through college in this economy. And that means you have to care about fourth grade reading. You have to care about eighth grade math. You have to care about what the coursework that students complete in high school, because that's the single most strong predictor of how well they do in college. So we gotta help people care about those things once again. And that's where the business community could be a super good partner, as they were way back when with us. But
it feels like they're more afraid now. They're really, I think most businesses are smart now in that they don't want to wade into anything that isn't feel good, anything that might have a backlash, especially with teachers. What you just said though, I'm thinking about these milestones that we all know about, like kids coming to kindergarten ready to learn and prepared, having learned some things before they get their third, fourth grade reading, eighth grade algebra, and a certain series of coursework beginning in ninth grade that prepares you to do something after 12th. Right. And those all seems like different rooms. Seems like the people that are captains of each of those milestones exist in different rooms, and no one's actually put the puzzle together to say, no, guys.
Yeah.
y'all have to be in the same room. You have to early ed, successful K1, start with K1 and third and fourth grade reading, eighth grade math, ninth through 12th grade prep for life. Like that's not one agenda. Those are multiple agendas. And you have politicians who are like, listen, don't make me talk about anything other than early ed.
Yeah.
Because that K-12, those K-12 years are rife with all kinds of politics. So I'm going to be a safe, for instance, Democrat. I'm going to be a safe Democrat and say, we need to make sure every kid gets a great start in life.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think that's a problem. If people would coalesce around anything, I wish they would coalesce around high school, because I think we know from experience that demands at the high school level can actually drive change all the way down. But doing better with youngest children doesn't drive change up. If you look at the data, for example, you see that kids have entered high school over the past 10 or 15 years better prepared than those that preceded them. but they've left high school less well prepared. So, so in a high school, when you talk to high school people about students coming in better prepared, they just kind of look at you like, huh? But the truth is, the data says they are. So I do worry. It's not that I don't believe in early childhood education. I'm a data freak, and I can see the data. But if it's all lost in the high schools, then it doesn't do us much good. So I do think that pressure from colleges and high schools down can drive more change than investments on the early side up. And so we need to figure that out better.
Yeah. And I used to call high school the last exit to Soulville, meaning like, this is your last chance, man. You get it wrong here and life is going to look bad for you. So we have a comment here from Maureen Kelleher who says, question, what about accountability within schools? Can you talk about how principals build cultures of improvement and trust among adults so people can admit mistakes and improve?
Yeah, that's a super, super good question. One of the things that Karen Chenoweth has done in her work, what Karen has done with her research and books is to take the schools that are getting unusually good results from those scatter plots, and actually then spend a lot of time with teachers and principals and kids and families, frankly, at those schools to try to understand what it is they do. And there is no question that the principals are always credited as having led that change. And when you dig underneath and see sort of what that looks like, it's a lot of teaming. So these are principals who, by and large, they're not the ones we do movies about. They're not the bring a bat, right? They're mere mortals by and large. But what they're amazingly good at is building a community amongst their teachers, creating a sense of ownership, using data, and data of all sorts. It's not just test data. In fact, test data is probably the least important part of what they do, although important. But they're looking at assignments. They're looking at the work kids are turning in. So what you're seeing is either grade level teams, subject area teams, teachers frequently together, often using let's all teach this unit the same way together, and then let's get together tomorrow and unpack how it went. And let's look at the work kids did in response, see what we can learn from that about how to make those lessons ever better. So, and that, it's hard. It's hard for teachers to bring their assignments for their peers to look at. It's hard for them to share the student work that came in response to it. But in our experience, either in our observation, the first 6 weeks of that are painful because teaching has historically been a very private act. And making it public, even just with your colleagues, is hard. But once you do that and teachers see how they can learn from each other and, how one teacher got these way better results by doing it this way, then you really can build an improvement trajectory that's just mind-numbingly good.
One of the things that we've said on this show before and talked to few people about is that we have a lot of heat for teachers, but we don't oftentimes talk about principals and everything that could be said about the prep programs for teachers probably could be said double for how we produce good principals or don't produce good principals. And that's a shame because there's fewer of them. So you should be able to do a good job of creating great principals, right? And it doesn't feel like we have that part figured out, really.
Right. Because it's both about picking people who are, likely to be able to be that kind of principal that I just described, and then about training them. I've always thought that in the end, the best way to do this is by identifying our best principals and assigning them roles and preparing the new ones, right? So let's learn from the best as opposed to from some ed school someplace. My own sense is that principal preparation is way too important to be left to higher education. It's just period.
That's a damning thing to say.
Yeah, well,
like,
I spent a lot of time working with higher ed, so yeah, it comes from experience.
That there's a question there for me around, like, as you did the arc of your work, as like, you had a trajectory, and it's just natural that you grow some degrees. I've never seen it in you, in watching you for years, any degree of cynicism or even real frustration, but there had to be some, Katie. I mean, you're a human being. So like, did you nurse any grudges about things that just stopped making sense to you in the work?
Any grudges?
And grudges about people, but just about maybe issues that you eventually came to say, this is so damn frustrating. I can't understand why this is still a thing.
Well, ed schools would be high on that list. People kept saying, why don't you guys, Ed Trust really needs to do some work on the ed school side. And I'm like, no. I've watched too many other people who are really, really talented try and fail. No, I think the bigger challenge, sort of underneath, I think what you're asking, Chris, is how do you avoid not just becoming depressed, right? So there were long periods of time when we were not moving the needle. And in fact, the impetus that led to No Child, like it or not, was this long period of time during the 90s when achievement was relatively flat and the gaps between groups of kids were actually getting wider. So after people could kind of lull themselves prior to that into thinking, well, things, they're maybe getting better too slowly, but they're getting better. And then during the 90s, it was just like, oh, God. But that's, I suppose, when we really started digging more and more into the exceptions, right? What do you learn from those? And for me personally, when I'd get kind of into a funk about it, because I knew my own sense of optimism and hope was important as a communicator, right? If I couldn't both show the horrible data, but also convey a sense of optimism and possibility about fixing those problems, then I was, not doing my job. So for me, it was go to George Hall, go to, Tubman, go to one of these schools that was just hitting it out of the park, and sit in classrooms, get excited about what really good teaching looks like. And that usually, I have to do that, once or twice a year, and in some years, a few extra times in order to okay, I'm ready again. Right. So, yeah.
Did you ever second guess yourself in the middle of all of that by saying, the education establishment was telling people how to get it right, but they weren't the same remedies oftentimes that you push for? I mean, when the establishment says smaller class sizes, pay teachers more, have more respect for teachers, desegregate the schools, which actually was the biggest one. That's the biggest bullet. Stop having hyper concentrated poor schools and poor neighborhoods or whatnot. Yeah. Were you ever sympathetic to the idea of, hey man, if we ever really just did that on a big scale, that would eliminate a lot of the problems that we're looking at?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely, especially around issues of segregation and integration. I mean, at some level, how can you not want more kids to be educated together, right? It just, all the research, all of experience suggests, that young people are more likely to have cross-racial friendships, working integrated workplace. There, all the stuff that we would like as a country are advanced by integrated schools. But you sat, as I did, in Oakland when, I created the organization in California that was sort of Ed Trust-like. And at that point, we were 92% African-American, Latinos just starting to get a foothold, and, a handful of whites. And you're saying, okay, if integration is the only way to have high achievement, we're stuck, really, right? We're stuck. And what kind of a message does that send? And they say, well, we could integrate, Gary Orfield would say, well, there are all these regional desegregation possibilities. You could take Piedmont from out of the donut hole of Oakland, and you could integrate with those kids, or you could go over the hill to Orinda and Moraga with all the rich white kids, and you're going, and yeah, that's going to happen when, for whom, really? So, I mean, it just seemed to me that I am glad for people to work on integration. Our sense was we don't have time, right? While others are working on that, let's acknowledge that there are schools that are educating all Black kids or all Latino kids or all poor kids, and they're doing great. So let's do that while we're working on this. Plus,
this is my biggest problem,
if you did that, you'd have easier integration anyway. So if you wanted, right?
Well, if the schools were, like, listen, high performing, we've learned this from HBCUs, a high performing or a good value Black school is going to attract white students at some point.
Yeah, that has definitely happened with HBCUs.
Yeah, white people are smart about like locating a good value. So, so the Orfields of the world get on my nerves because they start with a premise that we can generally appreciate and agree with, but because their thing that they've been working on for 20, 30 years in some cases hasn't worked, they have to attack other reforms to say, we literally right now in Minnesota have a bill that is being written and pending that partially comes out of Orfield's brother here, Myron Orfield, that will literally penalize high-performing, culturally affirming charter schools for not attracting white students. So if they will be put on a 3-year plan if they don't attract white students, and if they don't attract white students within that 3 years, they will lose money. They will literally lose money. Doesn't matter about achievement. Doesn't matter how they're doing, whether the kids are happy, whether the parents put them there on purpose, whether the parents are satisfied or whatnot. They will literally lose money if they don't attract white students in 3 years, within 3 years. And because we're Minnesota, all white schools, though, will be held harmless. It's only targeted at desegregating schools of color, right?
What's the rationale for that?
Integration is the only way for those kids to learn. Like the government is not fulfilling, their argument is the government is not fulfilling its constitutional purpose to an equal education if the kids are segregated. But segregation in Minnesota and by this law will only mean when kids of color are together. It won't mean when we have entire school districts where almost everybody's white. Right. So that means like I can't go in outstate Minnesota and go to a school district and be like, you know what y'all need? Y'all need some Negroes here because y'all ain't got none. Right. Like I won't be able to do that, but they will be able to walk into a charter school, a high performing Afrocentric charter school or Latino charter school or Hmong school and say, if you don't get any white students, we're going to take money from you.
Interesting. And does that apply to traditional school districts, high performing predominant? Wow.
Yeah. But I mean, it's going to end up where the only people that get a punishment are going to be schools that serve high populations of kids of color, not schools that serve high populations of white kids.
Yeah.
So you'll punish one group. And that's where we are with our educational theology now, right? Integration is the one way to make it happen. Now, I went to the same people that we're talking about who are pushing this because I've worked with them in the past on integration stuff and said, are you guys going to touch teaching at all? Teaching and learning and any of that stuff, pedagogy, curriculum. No, Chris, because integration is the thing that will make it, all better. So I'm only saying that to say we're losing ground, I think, on what I saw as the most powerful focus, which is what you had, which you had is on, let's look at the schools that are doing well with kids and get kids where they need to be.
Yeah.
Let's stop waiting for magic to happen,
Yeah. Well, that focus can come back, right?
You think so? Oh, good.
Absolutely.
Tell me more. All right.
No, absolutely. But it needs strong coalitions to bring it back. And right now we're hampered by the business community being less courageous than it should be, although maybe we start with a list of CEOs who started on the voting rights work and shame some of their peers into getting involved in that. Maybe the next step for them is some shaming around achievement and the need. I mean, when they look at their workforce possibilities, they have to be concerned.
That's true.
And especially those that want a diverse workforce, but higher at the high education levels. So there's partnerships to be made there.
You think so, Katie? You're Californian, at heart. If you think
am.
about the Googles, the Facebooks of the world or whatnot, I can't think of bigger income equality than like the Palo Alto school district type of area, and so I think those companies have just taken on. Yeah, we'll give some pity money to the schools, but we're really going to import talent.
Yeah. No, some people said at one point that we should just stop the H-1B visas, and if you require people to educate kids here and for those jobs, that things might be a little different.
Or they might ship those jobs overseas.
Well,
they'll end up doing.
That is what will scare the policymakers, right?
Well, I want to. You did the Kati Haycock thing that I love so much, which is like, well, if we're going to talk about this, let's have some facts on the table, which I have always appreciated about your work. So some of this, I think, gives me hope. I was looking at some of these data points that you sent over. We have, I don't know if your point here is that we have a good number of Black students and Black people that are achieving both in K-12 and higher education by the numbers. So when I see something like almost 11,000 Black students and 80,000 Latino students earned a 5, which is the top score on the AP exam, are we saying that that's good, or are we saying that that's what we start with?
Well, okay. So if you look at percentages, you'd be dismayed. Yeah, but then there are a whole bunch of people who look at the overall data and don't see that there are exceptions to that. So as we're building a case that says, yes, there are glaring problems. Black and Latino kids in particular are lagging behind where Asian kids and white kids are. But don't be confused by that. That doesn't mean they all are. And there are kids every single day who are hitting it out of the park on AP exams, on SAT, on admission to colleges, and so on. So it's about dispelling the myths that are in people's heads about who can't learn. And I'm afraid in too many people's heads, there's an image that says, yeah, I know about these gaps, and that means they're all there. They're not.
That actually, I think, is one of my biggest points to take away from a lot of your work is stop pretending like failure is universal for any group, any subgroup. There are Black kids that are knocking out of the park. Stop ignoring them. And they're poor kids. This number on the AP, you mentioned Florida earlier in the discussion. So Florida, one of the things I remember from a Jeb Bush presentation that you did here in Minnesota was that they had a 300% increase in Black students not taking AP exams, but actually passing them. So when you hear that type of growth, you have to ask yourself, okay, 300% increase in the number taking it. Something happened between the not passing and the passing, and we should all learn from that. You're also saying here that approximately 2,200 Black students, almost 5,000 Latino students scored at the top levels of the SAT. The UNCF puts out a lot of information around this, and their thing is the percentage that actually pass in all 4 categories, I think might be their thing. Like the totally college, the ones that graduate ready to ace all parts is like extremely low, like 12% or something like that, 5%. But when we look at the aggregate numbers, it's nice to know that we have a population to study. Okay, what's going on with you guys? I want to get down to Kentucky. What are these two things showing me about Kentucky here? Yeah,
what I'm basically trying to show here is what those scatter plots we were talking about earlier look like, right? So this is scatter plot that plots poverty rate across the bottom and achievement on the left axis. And what you see, what professors always want you to see is that red line, right? And it says, as the poverty level of the school gets higher, the achievement on average goes down. But what the second slide there shows you is if you look at the circle on the right there, it shows you that among those high poverty schools, there's a huge range in achievement from those that are at the very, very bottom to those that are quite quite high achieving. And if you look at the circle at the top, what you're seeing is that at all levels of income distribution, there are schools that are unusually high achieving. And so it's the schools in the kind of intersection of the box of the two circles there that Karen would go study, right? So those are the ones that we can really learn from, suggesting once again that demography is not destiny, that what schools do actually matters.
It seems like if you look at these two slides, it's a choice about it's about making a choice. What do you want to believe about education and the people that are being educated? I can't think of a good reason to choose the red line, the regression line. I can't think of like what it does for you to say, no, let's stick by that as the law, except to say we don't want to hold anybody accountable for what the people are doing in the second.
And that's, that's something that Ron Edmonds used to lecture, before we were even around, right? So back in the 60s, the whole effective school thing, what he used to say over and over again is, how many schools do I have to show you that serve poor kids or Black kids effectively for you to believe that it's about not about the kids, but about us? And if the answer to that is more than one, I suggest there's something wrong with you. And I think he was dead right.
So Ron Edmonds, who had the effective schools movement, actually looked at those schools and said, here's my takeaway on what we can learn from them. And I think part of the problem, probably, I don't know if you agree with this, that happens is that people go out and try and say, okay, here's the recipe. Here's the 5 things that he found. And then when they fail to replicate, when they fail to be able to make it work, then they say, it must be junk science.
Must be the kid. Yeah, must be the kids after all.
Must be the kids. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's there's a lot of human nature that goes there, right? So how do you get up every morning and go to work at a school if you believe that the low results are your fault, not the kids?
Yeah.
It's much easier over time to blame it on them. And that's why there need to be these outside voices, whether they're parent voices or others, that say, no. Look, there's a school right here that serves kids just like ours, getting better results. We can do better. It's not the kids. But unless there's somebody constantly pressing there, unless our systems constantly press there, our school district leaders, our state leaders, our activists of all sorts, then it's just too easy.
You need a less fragile workforce is what I think. Because the fragility in the workforce is weird, and it's middle class, and it's very pampered in a way to me. What we need are tough-minded. I feel this way just coming out of social services, where oftentimes you're working with some of the toughest cases and you're doing case notes every day, and you're not making the type of progress where you're changing the whole world, but you've accepted the fact that the part of the job is to work with tough scenarios and tough situations where there's not going to be a perfect answer every night. But you don't stop serving your families. Like, you keep working with them. If you're a social worker, you don't say, oh my God, we didn't get everybody out of poverty today. No, you wake up the next day, you do your case notes, and you're kind of tough-nosed about it. But what's Michigan showing us here? Poverty versus achievement in Michigan. Same thing,
right? We could graph the line, but I'd rather look at the circle and look at those schools at the top and say, okay, where are they? Let's go visit. Let's learn from them.
So is that like one of the main strategies of everything that we're talking about, and education trust and your theology just in general, is to let's look at this. This is where success is we're gonna find success.
Yep.
Yeah.
But the same thing in that next slide there. So what that looks at is the performance of low-income African-American kids in 4th grade reading. So I know you care a lot about reading, so I picked reading. But again, if you looked at national data, you would see that, low-income African-American kids on average do less well than other students. But if you look just at low-income African-American kids, and you look across the urban districts that participate in TUDA, what you see are whopping differences in the performance of the same group of kids. Right. So on the left-hand side, you see, I can hardly read those numbers.
On the left, it's Boston, right?
Yeah, Boston, Charlotte, and Tampa. So the 3 on the left-hand side, and then Cleveland, Fresno, and Detroit on the right. And the difference between those, just in the performance of poor Black kids at 4th grade, is more than 2 grade levels.
Wow.
So yeah, so I want to learn from the places that are doing better. And if you, I mean, the same thing is true when you look at the grade 4 math, you know, whopping 2 to 3 grade level differences, but also differences in this horizontal bar one in improvement. So right there, you're looking at improvement. Oh, shoot.
Are you still looking at this one, the change in scale scores by district, low income? And it looks like some of the biggest is, I want to say that's the district. That might be DC at the top there.
Yeah, for some reason, I have lost the video here. Ah.
Oh, you can't see us anymore?
No.
Oh.
Where did it go? No.
Well, this is okay. I actually, so I get like this one that we're looking at right now. I get this big difference between the growth of DC, for instance, and Cleveland.
Exactly.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and on the previous ones, like, you know, if I were, I would be saying to myself, I don't want to put my kids in Fresno, but I might want to put them in Boston.
Yeah.
But if I were believing that that failure is just universal, if you're poor and you're Black, it's just going to be universal, I wouldn't be seeing these underlying stories. And I would never be able to improve on these underlying stories. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Correct.
I see popped in again.
Yeah. No, I figured out how to get. Oh, now
I got doubles on you. Two Katies.
Oh, wait. Here we go. There we go. We're back to one Katie. Thank God.
Good. So this is, to me, this is when I talk about the achievement gospels, I don't think that people always understand what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm trying to say is actually we need the good news of what's working so that we can keep doing the work to progress, to make our kids do better.
Right.
Studying failure, getting lost in the essentialism of like, listen, demography actually is destiny, is cultural suicide. It's actually educational suicide. If we as Black parents and parents of color and people who care about our communities and care about success suck down that message, that literally is Jim Jones Kool-Aid. Yeah. That is like the worst message we can drink down. And it starts with us. This is why I like your information. You've done a real service to us over time by saying, if you're going to think that way, Chris, let me give you some information that's going to help you prove your case and be informed. I can't think of a bigger service to activism, like a bigger service than to say, people are going to tell you you're crazy. They're going to tell you you don't understand numbers and you don't, you know, I'm not going to mention a person. I had a nationally known edu celebrity for years, PhD, who said to me publicly, Chris, you know very little about education. And especially now, as I go into my fourth decade of being a parent, a public school parent with kids still in the pipeline, I thought to myself, this is the problem with professionals. This is the problem with professionals. They don't know when they're wrong. They don't know that they're wrong when they're wrong, and they will have you thinking all the wrong stuff about yourself. So what I want to say to you in the end of all of this, and I hope we can keep talking, which is I've always so appreciated the fact that you were like, if we had a Bible of the achievement gospels, there would definitely be a book of Katie.
Well, that's very kind of you to say that. Very kind.
You know, as we end and as we wrap, you're supposedly retired, which I always say to people because I think you guys are still doing work. Where are you now? You're like, no. Where are you now on your assessment of the world? I mean, you came, you saw, you conquered, you did a lot. And you have to be reading some of the news and the tea leaves about where we are now. Where are you on the hope meter? Where are you on the, like, listen, guys, we should focus. And you're not focusing. Like, what is your analysis of where we are in the moment?
I am worried. I choose always to see the possibilities as opposed to get, you know, sort of overwhelmed by cynicism. But I think we got two problems staring us in the face right now. One is not enough concern about outcomes, even after a lot of kids have been out of school for a year. And that there's not more worry about that alarms me. But second, I do worry about the increased polarization in the country, in our political system. And I know that good policy and education is much more likely if you got bipartisan agreement. And so how to do both of those things, both create a sense of urgency and build back some bridges so that people can actually do what matters, it's going to take some work.
Wow. Well, I guess that's for those of us that are carrying on for the next wave of this reform. That's our job. Our job is to actually make all sides of the power dynamic see what's possible. That's right. And actually work on behalf of kids. I appreciate you. Please come back again and let's stay in touch with each other. For those of you all watching, I usually tell people how to reach our guest, but our guest probably doesn't want you.
Yeah, I'm fine with that. My email, give my email is fine.
All right. Well, if anybody's interested, I will give you Katie's connections, how to connect with her. So for those listening and watching, this has been an hour with the founder and former CEO of the Education Trust, Kati Haycock, who has a long-standing track record of showing us what data can tell us about schools that work for kids. If we want a better schools movement, if we want a movement that actually shows us what's possible rather than continuously tells us what's not possible, this is where we want to be. This is where we need to be looking for inspiration. And I see people in the comments. Thank you all for listening, for watching, for being here. I see some of you saying, I'm interested or whatever. Let's get this achievement gospels going. Let's make this happen, everybody.
Well, with an advocate like you, Chris, it's going to happen. Thank you.
I appreciate